On the 3rd of September 2025, a ceremony was held in the city of Beijing, in the People's Republic of China, to mark the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. The event was obviously attended by Xi Jinping, the head of state of the People's Republic of China, while the two most prominent guests were Vladimir Putin, the ruler of Russia, and Kim Jong-un, the third member of the Kim family to rule North Korea since the Second World War ended. The anniversary celebrations generated international media attention, not because of the event itself, but owing to a conversation which occurred between Xi and Putin while they were simply strolling along. This was caught on a hot microphone. The two leaders were basically making small talk about immortality, that is. While they strolled towards Tiananmen Square, the two men discussed how biotechnology was developing swiftly, and how there was a growing belief that with organ transplants, people could potentially live to be 150 years old or more in the near future. Perhaps they need never die. For obvious reasons, the international media were drawn to a discussion involving three men who are broadly considered to be dictators of their nations with no intention of relinquishing power in China, Russia, or North Korea anytime soon, discussing the possibility of potentially living into the 22nd century. It's a peculiar ascent, in particular, for Vladimir Putin. While North Korea has been ruled by the Kim family since the Second World War, and China has been a one-party state since the Communists won the long-running Chinese Civil War in 1949, nobody knew who Vladimir Putin was just over a quarter of a century ago. The world was blindsided when Russia's first post-Soviet leader, Boris Yeltsin, named him as his interim successor on New Year's Eve 1999. Only 10 years earlier, he had been a middling KGB agent in East Germany. Where did this man come from? Did he come out of nowhere? Or was his family involved in politics and the security services in Russia in a more long-standing way? This is the story of the Putins. Very little is known about the ancestors of Vladimir Putin. They were not prominent political figures or involved in the powerful Russian Orthodox Church, nor were they major landholders or people who made their mark on Russian life in an alternative way during the 18th and 19th centuries. Russia was a backward society as well throughout this time. Serfdom didn't end until 1861. Vast parts of the country east of the Ural Mountains were barely inhabited, and the first nationwide census was not undertaken across the entirety of the Russian Empire until 1897. It was the only such recording of all of Russia's citizens carried out in the Imperial era. Given all of these factors, establishing the genealogical line of a particular family in Russia back beyond the 19th century is especially fraught with difficulty. What's clear enough, though, is that the Putins must not have been a wealthy or powerful family of any kind. They lived in the Tver Governorate, a region in European Russia to the northwest of Moscow on the main route to St. Petersburg. Studies have identified potential ancestors as far back as 1628, when Yakov Nikitin, a plausible ancestor, was recorded in a scribal book for the region around the village of Borodino, west of Moscow. Interestingly, the lands in question were owned by Ivan Romanov, an uncle of Tsar Michael I, the first ruler of the Romanov dynasty that ruled Russia down to 1917. The first member of the family for whom we have detailed information is Spiridon Ivanovich Putin. He was born in the Tver Governorate on the 19th of December 1879 to Ivan Petrovich Putin and Paraskeva Matvievna Putin. He consequently grew up in a time of considerable hardship for the Russian people and immense change in the empire. Not only had the abolition of serfdom transformed Russian society and its economy from 1861 onwards, but Tsar Alexander II had introduced wide-ranging reforms that liberalized Russia in further ways and began the industrialization of the country. These processes in turn led to the country becoming a hotbed of radical political thought, complete with growing numbers of anarchists, nihilists, and communists. In time, these movements would influence Russia's modern politics in ways which would shape the lives of the Putins in turn. When Spiridon was a boy of 12, he lived through the terrible Russian famine of 1891 to 1892. In the midst of this, Spiridon was sent off to work with a cousin at a local inn. The timing overlaps so well with the famine that it seems likely that his parents sent him there in order to have one fewer mouth to feed in their own household. Movement could mean survival in such conditions. A few years later, in the mid-1890s, Spiridon is understood to have moved to St. Petersburg, the shiny modern European capital that Tsar Peter the Great had built on the shores of the Baltic Sea at the start of the 18th century. There he began working as an apprentice cook. In the city, during the 1900s and 1910s, he was witness to remarkable events of the time, such as the response to Russia's humiliating defeat by Japan in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, the Russian Revolution that broke out in 1905, the attempt to form a Russian parliament or Duma owing to popular unrest at the autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas II, and finally the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. All the while, he continued to work as a cook. Legend has it that he served Grigory Rasputin, the mystic and healer who had inveigled his way into the good graces of the Imperial family after Rasputin visited the Hotel Astoria in St. Petersburg, opened in 1912. This account of Spiridon Putin's early life was a precursor to later events. In 1917, two different revolutions swept across Russia. The first was a conservative revolution in the spring designed to remove the Romanov dynasty from power, owing to the disastrous role Nicholas II had played as Russia's wartime leader. The second, in October or November 1917, depending on which calendar is being used, brought a much more radical government to power in St. Petersburg and Moscow, the Bolshevik Communists. Spiridon Putin abandoned St. Petersburg, renamed Leningrad by the revolutionaries after their leader Vladimir Lenin, once the October Revolution began, and headed back to his native Tver. Years of civil war followed, and eventually Spiridon went back to Leningrad. There he became a personal chef to Lenin. After his death in 1924 and the ascent of Joseph Stalin as the unrivaled dictator of the new communist Soviet Union in the second half of the 1920s, Spiridon reputedly became an occasional cook for the leader of the USSR. Because of how paranoid a ruler Stalin was, and how sensitive the position of preparing food for him was, it is understood that after a certain period of time, he became a member of the NKVD, the Soviet Secret Service agency which was a direct predecessor of the more well-known KGB. Thus, at first glance, Spiridon Putin was seemingly the first of the Putin dynasty to stand close to those in power in Russia. The only problem is, there is little real evidence to substantiate this view of Spiridon Putin's life during the Russian Civil War and afterwards under the rule of Joseph Stalin. Most of the information for Spiridon Putin's alleged ties to Lenin and Stalin and his role in the NKVD comes from public statements made in modern times by his grandson Vladimir. These featured prominently in a 2-hour-long documentary on Vladimir and his life that was distributed online in 2018 and was simply called Putin. In this, Vladimir was interviewed by Andrei Kondrashov, a reporter who right around the same time conveniently became Vladimir's election campaign's spokesperson. It was in this interview that Putin outlined his grandfather's work as a chef and claimed that he was a cook for both Lenin and Stalin at a dacha near Moscow. From there, the story grew legs. It was quickly assumed, for instance, that because he was a cook for the top brass of the Soviet leadership, that Spiridon must have also been a member of the NKVD. This was not an unreasonable claim to make, given that a dictator like Joseph Stalin didn't exactly let any chef at all prepare his food. Yet even beyond this speculation, a lot did not add up. For example, it was also claimed in the documentary that Spiridon continued to cook for Soviet leaders until shortly before his death. He died in 1965, when he was 86. It seems implausible that he continued as an active cook until that age. Above and beyond this, historians who know the Russian records have since looked into this and have found little to really support Vladimir's version of his grandfather's life. Clearly, Spiridon was a cook, and he certainly lived in St. Petersburg for much of his adult life. He may even have fleetingly cooked for Lenin and Stalin at some point in the 1920s, but it is more difficult to accept the idea that he was close to the Soviet leadership over a period of decades. Given what we know about the humble circumstances of the family in the middle of the 20th century, it simply does not make sense that Spiridon could have been on such close terms with several leaders of Russia over a long period of time. We are on only slightly firmer ground when it comes to the next generation of the Putins. Spiridon married a woman by the name of Olga Ivanovna. They had 4 sons and 2 daughters together between the late 1900s and mid-1920s. 2 of their sons would be killed fighting in the Second World War. Not a great deal is known about the lives of the others, though some of these branches of the Putin family do feature in news reports from time to time, owing to the manner in which they have benefited from Vladimir's control over Russia. A first cousin of his, Igor Putin for instance, who would be another grandson of Spiridon, is a well-known businessman in Russia, who had been in the military and then fortuitously began a very successful life in finance and business in the 2000s, after his first cousin became president of Russia. When tracing the story of Vladimir's branch of the family, the key figure amongst Spiridon and Olga's large brood of children is Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, or Vladimir Sr. He was born in 1911 and married Maria Ivanovna Shkrebneva in 1928, when they were both just 17 years of age, after meeting in Pominova near Moscow. They moved back to Leningrad, and Vladimir began military service in the Navy. Their first child, a boy named Albert, died in infancy. A second son, Viktor, was born before the outbreak of the Second World War. As we will see, he did not survive the war. The most famous of their children, indeed, the most famous of all the Putins, Vladimir Jr., would not be born until after the war. The Putins were living their lives against the backdrop of incessant change in Russia. First, there had been the reforms of the 19th century and the modernization of the country. Then the unrest in the final decades of the Tsarist system, the First World War, the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Civil War. As though that was not enough, life in Russia was punctuated by frequent appalling famines, such as the one that struck the country in 1891 and 1892, though this was dwarfed by the famine of 1921 to 1922, which claimed the lives of an estimated 5 million people. A decade later, another bout of stretched resources caused the Holodomor, a famine in Ukraine and southwest Russia that was broadly caused by the Soviet regime's attempts to rapidly industrialize by creating collectivized farms and state-controlled food distribution systems. After that passed, Russia was plunged into the worst of the Stalinist purges and show trials. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, it was simply the next event in the timeline of endless struggles which Russia appeared to be going through. In any event, at first it went rather well for the Soviet Union. The Nazis and the Soviets reached an accommodation whereby they carved up Poland between them and Russia reconquered lands in the Baltic Sea region and in Bessarabia that had been lost at the time of the Civil War. However, things changed drastically in the summer of 1941 when the Nazis invaded, bent on crushing and conquering their ideological enemies, the Bolshevik communists of the Soviet Union. The Putin family would barely survive the war. Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin was already a military man even before the war started, having served in the Navy as a submariner. The German invasion, when it came in 1941, was primarily by land, and many mariners were redeployed to dry ground. Vladimir Sr. was among them. By the autumn of 1941, he was serving on the Leningrad front, the area in Estonia, east into Russia, that protected the advance of Germany's Army Group North on Leningrad. He barely survived a raid in mid-November 1941, when he was ordered to go behind enemy lines with a unit of men to try to capture a German to obtain information on the Nazi advance 30 kilometers from the outskirts of Leningrad. Most of those sent with Vladimir Sr. did not survive. He barely made it back alive, suffering from severe frostbite after being wounded, collapsing, and then being rescued by fellow Red Army soldiers. He spent months in hospital recovering, a piece of good fortune which meant he was not redeployed southwards to the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula or the Battle of Stalingrad, virtual death sentences where millions of Russian men lost their lives. He would be left with a limp for the rest of his life, though. Others were less fortunate. Maria's mother was killed in October 1941 by an exploding artillery shell west of Moscow, and Vladimir and Maria lost their second son. Young Victor died of diphtheria in June 1942 as disease spread around war-torn Russia. Vladimir's injuries meant that he was largely given administrative duties in the latter years of the war, and once the siege of Leningrad was lifted in January 1944, nearly 2.5 years after it first started, Vladimir and Maria were given their own apartment on the 5th floor of an apartment block on Baskov Lane. The apartment had no hot water or washing facilities, a single gas burner next to a sink, and a communal toilet crammed into a closet next to a stairwell. They would live here for the next 20 years. It was while they were living in their apartment on Baskov Lane, with the city having been substantially rebuilt out of the wartime ruins, that a minor miracle, at least as far as his parents were concerned, occurred for the Putins. On the 7th of October 1952, Maria gave birth to another son. They named him Vladimir, after his father. Presumably, they had come to believe that their family life would consist of just them, and the memory of the two sons who were taken from them. But now Maria had become pregnant and had a third son in her early 40s. His parentage was contested in later years by Vera Putina, a woman who, from 1999, began claiming that she was actually the mother of Vladimir Jr., that he was born in 1950, and that she gave him up for adoption, following which Vladimir Sr. and Maria became his adoptive parents in Leningrad. These claims have never been proven. However, they do point towards how shadowy the backstory of the Putin family is. Vladimir Jr. is the member of the Putin family who is known throughout the world today. He grew up in poverty. Even years after the war had ended, rats were a constant presence in the apartment blocks on Baskov Lane. He avoided the small, cramped apartment and became part of a street gang that hung around the courtyards of the various apartment buildings in the neighborhood. He attended a primary school in the city and then secondary school before heading to study at a technological institute. There, his focus was on chemistry and magnetics, in which he obtained a diploma in 1970. This was not a university degree. It was more like a specialism for a year of study at the end of high school. Thereafter, Vladimir headed to Leningrad State University. Vladimir's parents would live until very late in the 20th century, dying just over a year apart in 1998 and 1999. The general outline of Vladimir's life in the 1970s and 1980s is known, but there are many things about the specifics of it that are still debated to this day. There is a clear reason for this. After years of studying law at Leningrad State University, during which time he joined the Communist Party, he became a spy. In those days, the NKVD of the Stalinist era had been succeeded by the KGB, the Russian counterpart to the American CIA during the Cold War. Putin became an operative of the KGB. Perhaps he was already involved with the intelligence services while he was at university. This would make sense, given that as soon as he graduated, he immediately entered the 401st KGB training school in Leningrad. Over the next 10 years, he was largely involved in training, administrative duties, and various types of intelligence gathering in Russia itself. Claims that he was sent off to work undercover in Oceania and Asia, traveling between Singapore, Australia, New Zealand and Fiji in the late 1970s and early 1980s, are almost certainly false. In reality, Putin was charged with compiling intelligence reports on these countries from his desk in Russia. Then he was finally given an important foreign posting when he was sent to East Germany in 1985, the front line of the Cold War in Europe. In the German Democratic Republic, he was stationed in the city of Dresden. Here he liaised with the infamous East German secret services, the Stasi. It was also in East Germany that he started a family. In 1983, back in Russia, he had married Lyudmila Alexandrovna Ocheretnaya. They had 2 daughters together during his German posting, Maria, born in April 1985, and Katerina, born in August 1986. Putin's time in Germany with the KGB and the entire trajectory of his life was changed by events across Eastern Europe and within the Soviet Union from 1985 onwards. That was the year that Mikhail Gorbachev came to power as head of the USSR. He was a political reformer who was determined to modernize the Soviet Union through policies like glasnost and perestroika, open discussion of politics and market reforms to the communist economic system to make it more competitive. His reforms, as well as a series of events like the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in Ukraine in 1986, set off a chain of events which saw millions questioning the Soviet system across Eastern Europe. Protests and calls for reform escalated in 1988 and 1989, effectively leading to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet counterpart to the US-led NATO alliance in Europe. Then the Berlin Wall fell late in 1989 in a peaceful popular protest after the opening of a border crossing between Hungary and Austria had effectively rendered it pointless. By 1990, with its influence having collapsed amongst its former vassal states in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Poland, the future of the USSR itself was being debated. It was in this context that Putin returned to Russia in 1990. With the Berlin Wall having fallen and Germany reunified as a Western-leaning democratic nation in October 1990, there was no reason for him to remain in Germany any longer after a directive to destroy large amounts of KGB documentation in the Dresden office had been carried out. He came home to a country in crisis, where Gorbachev was caught between reformers who felt he had not gone far enough and conservatives who believed he was betraying the entire history of the Soviet Union. Thus, in late 1990 and through 1991, Putin was a witness to the collapse of both Gorbachev's authority and the USSR. After months of negotiations, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved on the 26th of December 1991, and the Russian Federation came into being. Gorbachev had stepped down the previous day and was replaced by Boris Yeltsin, a Moscow politician whose star had waxed as Gorbachev's waned in the early 1990s. Putin rose gradually up the political ladder, following his return to Russia from East Germany. He got his start from an old friend, a legal scholar and subsequently a politician who Putin had met in Leningrad State University in the early 1970s, Anatoly Sobchak. Sobchak had become mayor of Leningrad in the summer of 1991, the name of which city was now changed back to St. Petersburg once again. Over the next 5 years, Putin benefited from Sobchak's patronage and slowly rose as a mid-ranking official and politician in the city. It was a time when an astute man in a position like this could acquire many allies by facilitating the corrupt carving up of the country's huge state assets that was underway in the 1990s. Putin was transferred to Moscow in 1996 and given an official role in this process, as the new government, which was mired in an economic crisis in the 1990s, raised cash through the sale of everything from oil refineries to former Communist Party properties. In Moscow, he soon inveigled his way into the central circle of Yeltsin, who was by then in steep decline as a leader owing to his alcoholism. In 1997, Putin became deputy chief of the presidential staff, and in 1998 he was appointed as head of the FSB, a new security service that had succeeded the KGB. Despite these internal promotions, it nevertheless shocked the world when Yeltsin announced he was standing down from his position as first post-Soviet president of Russia on New Year's Eve 1999, and nominated the relatively unknown Putin as his interim successor. The rest of the world had to get to grips quickly with who Vladimir Putin was. In the presidential election that was held on the 26th of March 2000, Putin's interim position became permanent when he comfortably defeated his nearest challenger, the communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov. In his first years in charge, Putin oversaw a period of rapid growth. The Russian economy had contracted sharply after the Soviet Union collapsed at the start of the 1990s, and it continued to contract for most of the rest of the decade. The corner was turned in 1998 and 1999, and Putin was the beneficiary. In 2000, it grew by a huge 10%, and then it averaged growth rates of around 7% annually until the great financial crisis began in 2008. This economic rebound from the misery of the 1990s made Putin extremely popular at home, and he won a landslide victory to gain re-election as president in 2004. Meanwhile, the international community perceived him as a pragmatic reformer. Yeltsin minus the alcohol. Western countries continued to invest in Russia, and countries like Germany hooked themselves up to Russia's natural gas supply and became completely reliant on it for their energy needs. In 2002, the NATO-Russia Council was even established to mediate between the US-led alliance and post-Soviet Russia. When the 9/11 Islamic terrorist attacks on the US occurred in September 2001, Putin was amongst the first international leaders to ring President George W. Bush and commiserate with him. Many in the West believed Russia might flourish into a democracy under the new ruler. It was only gradually, beginning around 2003, as reports of his suppression of opposition at home in Russia spread, that this view began to sour. But even when it did, Western nations continued to give Putin a seat at the table with them for years to come. This was the international perception of Putin in the 2000s. The strange thing is that it seems so at odds with what he was actually doing during these years. There had been conflicts already in the 1990s in the Caucasus region, where boundary disputes had never been fully resolved between nations like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and where groups like the Chechens were trying to create their own breakaway states. Putin was a perennial presence in these conflicts in the 2000s, often intervening indirectly through allied proxies. Then, in August 2008, the short but significant Russo-Georgian War occurred. In this, Russian forces intervened directly in Georgia militarily and basically established two breakaway states out of Georgian territory, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These became quasi-autonomous states, though not recognized internationally. In reality, though, they were de facto new Russian provinces, while Chechnya also became a Russian client state in the course of these events. These were methods Putin would deploy on a larger scale in Ukraine 6 years later. More importantly, they point towards Putin's ideological outlook. He was aiming to begin reclaiming lands which had once formed parts of both the Russian Empire of the Tsars and the Soviet Union, and which had been lost when the USSR collapsed at the start of the 1990s. This has become clearer over time, as he has sought to acquire large parts of Ukraine and to tie Belarus into a closer union with Russia, as well as in his efforts to interfere in the politics of countries like Georgia and Moldova. International commentators typically note that he idolizes older Russian Tsars like Peter the Great, rather than the Soviet leaders like Joseph Stalin. The core point, though, is that he aims to rebuild Russia into an imperial power. In retrospect, it looks strange that the international community did not see this sooner. All of the signs were already there in the 2000s. Putin's true aims would become clearer over time. However, before he could try to manifest them, he needed to solidify his position at home in Russia. It is a peculiar thing about Russia's post-Soviet politics that it managed to create a reasonably strong democratic system after the Cold War ended. This is a country with a history and culture of terrible autocracy, and yet by the 2000s, a stable enough democratic system was in place that Putin felt he needed to abide by the constitution for many years after he became leader of the country. This meant he was term limited. The new Russian constitution stated that no person could serve more than 2 consecutive terms as president. Thus, as Putin's second term neared its end, he prepared to step aside in 2008. His successor was Dmitry Medvedev, an old ally of Putin's who had risen up through the political system as well in the 1990s in St. Petersburg and Moscow. In retrospect, Medvedev's term as president between 2008 and 2012 is viewed as nothing more than a constitutional nicety that was gone through in order to make it appear as though Putin was abiding by the constitution. As soon as Medvedev's term was finished, he stood aside and allowed his predecessor to come back for a third and fourth term. Then, when he faced the same problem of a third consecutive term in 2020, a new reset clause was introduced into the constitution which basically did away with the term limits that impeded him in 2008. Thus, Putin became the de facto dictator of Russia, though it is noteworthy that he felt the need to keep up the appearance of democratic norms in 2008 by allowing Medvedev to serve a term as president. The man who has dominated Russian politics since power was devolved to him on New Year's Eve is a reserved person in many ways. He is a workaholic who spends long hours at his desk or meeting people in the Kremlin. Putin is old-fashioned in his work. He continues to use pen and paper for a lot of it, and then hands over his thoughts to his staff to type up. He uses landline phones in his office rather than mobiles, unusual behavior as we enter the second quarter of the 21st century. Putin uses humor in a deliberate way, frequently doing so in public settings to dress down ministers whose work he is unhappy with. He is portrayed as having many hobbies. For instance, it is well known that he is an experienced practitioner of judo and has competed in the martial arts. He also engages in swimming, ice skating, and outdoors treks and endurance sports. A lot of this activity seems to be undertaken as part of a careful attempt to cultivate an image of Putin as a strong leader in contrast with the desk bureaucrats who, he believes, brought about the destruction of the Soviet Union and collapse of Russia's empire. He has several pet dogs and presents himself as a common Russian man in many ways. Large amounts of his personal and public conduct are stage-managed. For example, Putin speaks both German and English, yet he will almost always use an interpreter for public events with diplomats and politicians from the English-speaking world. The intention is clear. He should not have to speak English, as though the Western world is always paramount. Beyond this carefully crafted public image, there is no denying that Putin is a calculated and often brutal figure. There are very few world leaders today, for instance, who regularly dispense of their enemies by obscure poisons, such as the nerve gas Novichok, used in the 2018 Salisbury poisonings. But that is exactly what Putin is known for, often doing so to people in exile. He also silences dissent within Russia. Most infamously, it remains unclear what happened to anti-Putin campaigner Alexei Navalny, who died in an Arctic prison on the 16th of February 2024. Today, Putin is nearly always discussed in the context of the war against neighboring Ukraine. The causes of this are deep-seated and go back all the way to the end of the Cold War. Ukraine obtained its independence as the USSR fragmented into 15 different nations. However, at first, it remained a broadly pro-Russian state with close political and economic ties to Moscow. That began to change in the 2000s as Ukraine drew closer to Europe and the US. There was a tug-of-war here, with many in Ukraine favoring the idea of trying to join the European Union to transform Ukraine's economy. These conflicting visions of Ukraine in the 21st century boiled over in mid-November 2013, when the Euromaidan protests began in Kyiv after pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych declared that he would not be signing the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement and would instead develop closer ties to Russia. The fallout was rapid. Protests escalated. Yanukovych was forced out of office and into exile in Russia, and Putin decided to annex the Crimean Peninsula and invade eastern Ukraine. A regional conflict developed in the Donbas region over control of the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. Despite efforts at mediating between the two sides through the Minsk agreements, the conflict went on year after year. Indeed, over time, the problems became more intractable as Ukraine's determination to try to join the US-led NATO alliance made Putin even more determined to alter the political landscape in the country. The Western response to Russia's annexation of the Crimea and the start of the war in the Donbas in 2014 was surprisingly muted. It wasn't non-existent, however. Russia, for instance, was expelled from the G8 group of leading economic nations. Nevertheless, it was far from a robust response to a European nation-state invading a neighbour and annexing part of its territory. The bigger reaction came in February 2022, when Putin expanded the war, in part in response to accelerated efforts to bring Ukraine into the NATO alliance. Where previously the war had been confined to the Donbas region and had been largely fought using regional proxies, on the 24th of February, a massive Russian invasion of Ukraine commenced, with a large division of the Russian military heading for Kyiv to try to win a swift total victory in the war. This failed after the Russians ran into a surprisingly effective and resilient Ukrainian army. That is not to say, though, that the Russians failed to make advances. They extended the war in the east too, and have since secured complete control over the northern shore of the Sea of Azov. A brutal war of attrition has been underway since, one in which Russia continues to acquire territory, though at a very high price, often losing thousands of men to gain a burned-out town or village after months of fighting around it. In response, the Western world moved to essentially treat Russia as a pariah state, heavily sanctioning people tied to the regime, sanctioning Russian oil and gas, and freezing Putin out of international gatherings. Further flashpoints have concerned different parts of the world. For instance, Putin has grown Russia's involvement in the Sahel region in countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where previously the former colonial power, France, had an outsized influence here. In Syria, he has supported the regime of his ally Bashar al-Assad in the long-running civil war there since 2011, though his regime finally fell in December 2024, and al-Assad is now in exile in Russia. Finally, Putin has drawn closer to countries like Iran, China, and North Korea, as his relations with the US and the EU have deteriorated. A surprising development has been the manner in which India's leader Narendra Modi refused to overly condemn the expansion of the war against Ukraine. Instead, closer symbiotic relations between his nation and Russia were developed from 2022 onwards. This is all about the politics of oil. India's economy is growing rapidly, and it needs large amounts of cheap fossil fuels to fuel economic expansion in a country home to roughly 1/6 of the world's population. As Russian oil was heavily sanctioned by the West, and once global energy prices fell dramatically in 2023 and 2024, Russia began selling a large amount of its oil to India at cheap rates. All of this occurred as Putin was under investigation by the International Criminal Court at The Hague in the Netherlands. Many war crimes have been committed in Ukraine by Russia since the extension of the conflict in 2022. But the ICC's decision to issue an arrest warrant for Putin in March 2023 was primarily related to the abduction of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children from the east of the country. The ICC judgment and arrest warrant has theoretically limited Putin's ability to travel internationally. However, a majority of countries are not enforcing the warrant. In the midst of the war, Putin faced the gravest threat to his position that he has ever encountered, even if it was a fleeting one. It came from Yevgeny Prigozhin. Putin and Prigozhin had many things in common. They had both been obscure individuals when the Soviet Union fell, and they were both opportunists who managed to benefit from the chaos of the 1990s. Putin transformed from being a spy to become a politician and then president of the Russian Federation at the very end of the 1990s. In the same period, Prigozhin had started numerous business ventures and eventually settled on being a restaurateur. He prospered by catering to the new class of wealthy oligarchs that emerged during those years via the sale of state assets. In the 2000s, he went from being a chef who catered to Putin and his inner circle to acquiring lucrative state contracts to supply food to schools. Then, in 2014, he moved over into privatized security and co-founded the Wagner Group. Within a short period of time, it was turned into an elite mercenary unit that was active in the Middle East, in the Syrian civil war, and parts of Africa. By the time the war in Ukraine started, Prigozhin was a key figure in the Russian military complex, and the Wagner Group began to play a leading role in it as an elite unit. Prigozhin also became increasingly vocal in his criticisms of the central planning of the war. This culminated on the 23rd of June 2023, when he launched a revolt against the government, taking over the city of Rostov-on-Don and sending divisions of troops hurtling at speed towards Moscow. From his appearance during a television broadcast denouncing Prigozhin's actions, Putin was clearly very concerned about the turn of events. And then, bizarrely, Prigozhin gave up. He ordered his men to stop on their way to Moscow, and he pulled out of Rostov-on-Don. 2 months later, he was killed in an airplane accident which was almost certainly orchestrated by Putin. The Russian leader had survived the biggest threat to his hold on power. Prigozhin had justified his revolt on the grounds that the troops at the front were not getting sufficient support in terms of weapons and so forth. It would be easy to suggest that this was a sign of the Russian economy and war production experiencing difficulties. However, this was not the case. The reality is that the Russian economy actually did very well out of the extension of the war in 2022. International oil and gas prices soared as Western nations tried to grapple with sanctioning a country which nations like Germany had become completely reliant upon to sustain their energy needs. Thus, while the Western world believed it could punish Russia economically through sanctions, in reality doing so massively increased the inflation crisis those nations were facing coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, while Russia benefited. The ramping up of the wartime economy and war production also helped Russia economically to begin with, yet this only lasted so long. By the start of 2024, oil and gas prices had plummeted right back down, and Russia's economic situation has started to suffer. It is also believed that Russia has lost more than 1 million men in the war in Ukraine in terms of killed and wounded. A huge number, which explains why Putin called on his ally, the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, to begin providing troops from his nation to fight in Ukraine in 2024. The war has entered a strange phase in 2025 following the election of Donald Trump for a second non-consecutive term as President of the United States. Trump campaigned on rhetoric that he would end the war in Ukraine within days of entering office. That has not happened, but his administration has attempted to enter into peace negotiations. On the face of it, both sides should be willing to consider ending the war. Ukraine has been devastated by the long-running conflict, which has displaced millions of people internally and creates daily threats from drone and missile attacks to the safety of the people in Kyiv and other cities away from the front line. Russia is also suffering, with over 1 million soldiers dead or wounded, an economy that is showing the strain of war and a damaged international standing. Most importantly, while Russia is very slowly conquering eastern Ukraine, Putin is aware that this is occurring at a glacially slow rate and that complete victory in the sense of conquering Kyiv will probably remain elusive. Therefore, both sides had reason to enter into peace negotiations in 2025 when the Trump administration entered office. The results, though, were far from satisfactory for any side during Trump's first year in office. Negotiations undertaken in Riyadh, Istanbul, and Alaska were peculiar in that they often did not involve Ukrainian delegations. For instance, the controversial meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska on the 15th of August 2025 was basically a bilateral meeting that excluded Ukraine. Conversely, the Americans have oscillated between very public spats with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and other more positive engagements. Putin has been consistent over a single issue, though. For him, Russia will not tolerate any negotiated peace that does not give binding guarantees that Ukraine will never become a member of NATO, the US-led military alliance. On the eastward expansion of the alliance, he has been consistent in his virulent opposition to it. Putin's private life has become a source of commentary during the years that Russia has been at war with Ukraine. At the start of April 2014, in the weeks between the annexation of the Crimea and the start of the war in the Donbass, it was announced by the Kremlin that Putin had finalized his divorce from his wife of 3 decades, Lyudmila Shkrebneva. They had been separated for at least a year, and possibly several years. Reports on this vary. There has been wide-ranging speculation about Putin having various mistresses over the years. It seems plausible that he did, but at the same time, he has always been quite secretive about this, and he keeps his relationships private. The only long-term relationship that he appears to have had beyond his marriage is with Alina Kabayeva. She is a former Russian gymnast who was born back in 1983 and who won the gold medal in the all-round gymnastics event at the Summer Olympics in Athens in 2004. In 2007, she was elected to the State Duma, the lower house of the Russian parliament, as a member of Putin's United Russia Party. It must be stated that while there have been incessant reports about their relationship, it has never actually been confirmed. They were photographed together as early as 2001, but this was at a sporting event where he was in attendance as Russian president, and she was there as an active gymnast at the time. It is widely believed that in 2015 and 2019, she gave birth to 2 sons named Ivan and Vladimir, of whom Putin is the father. If this is true, then we might well begin to see them emerge as political figures in Russia in the 2030s once they grow up. Putin is as secretive about his wealth as he is inconspicuous about his family life. There is no doubting that he is extremely wealthy. Indeed, certain international experts on Russia theorize that he might actually be the wealthiest man in the world. It is impossible to judge this in any concrete way, though, as nearly all of his assets are hidden from view. On paper, Vladimir earns a salary of around $150,000, though obviously it has fluctuated over a quarter of a century at the top of the state. It is also publicly known that he owns many houses, including a lavish holiday retreat on the coast of the Black Sea, a typical perk of being ruler of Russia going back to the late 18th century when the Romanovs and senior aristocrats began holidaying in the warmer climate here, when St. Petersburg and Moscow were much colder. Putin owns many properties beyond this, though how many is unclear. Although it is not registered in his name, it is pretty clear that he also owns a super yacht, which is believed to be worth around $500 million currency adjusted from rubles. Beyond this, it is believed that Putin has billions of dollars stashed away in banks and other repositories. Most of these are in Russia, especially so since the Western world began freezing Russian assets in response to events in Ukraine. But some are undoubtedly tucked away in banks in Switzerland or somewhere in the Middle East, to prepare for the relatively unlikely possibility that he is ousted from power one day and has to fall back on money hidden abroad after going into exile. There is more to the Putin dynasty than just Vladimir Putin, although for reasons that are very obvious, he is the person within the family that generates the most attention. As we have seen, both of his siblings died in infancy, and he does not have any nieces or nephews. He does have first cousins, who are the offspring of his parents' siblings. The most prominent is Igor Putin, Vladimir's uncle's son, a prominent businessman who has benefited enormously from Vladimir's time in office and who has been heavily sanctioned by Western countries since 2022 and the expansion of the war in Ukraine. Igor's son, Roman, is also reputed to be enormously wealthy and has followed a career as both a businessman and as a politician. Curiously, he became involved in leading a new political party named People Against Corruption in 2020, but this does not appear to have been any effort to challenge his cousin. Rather, it was designed as a rebuff to Alexei Navalny, the prominent anti-Putin campaigner who had focused primarily on corruption issues in Russia and whose party was named the Anti-Corruption Foundation before it was banned in stages between 2019 and 2021. Perhaps Roman Putin will begin to play a more prominent role in Russian politics in time to come. He is only in his late 40s, and there is time to prepare him for doing so. There certainly is no sign of any kind that Putin's 2 daughters from his marriage intend to play a role in Russian politics in future. This is perhaps reflective of the country's modern politics. Although Russia went through a period of unusually sustained female rule in the 18th century, in the 20th century under the Soviet Union, the country basically did not have a single prominent female political leader. Instead of politics, Maria Vorontsova is a pediatric endocrinologist who sits on the board of the Moscow Society of Medical Genetics. Interestingly, given her father's recent discussion with Xi Jinping about the possibility of extending a person's life well into a second century, she has led research teams that have received large amounts of funding to study increasing life longevity, organ printing, and other anti-aging methods. She has 2 young sons from 2 different marriages. Her youngest sister, Katerina, is the director of Inopraktika, a $1 billion project to develop an advanced scientific center at the Moscow State University. Her background is in a strange combination of Japanese history, mathematics, and physics. She is believed to have a daughter. Thus, while neither of Putin's daughters from his marriage is actively involved in politics, they both have senior academic posts in Moscow that have obtained huge amounts of funding. They were both sanctioned by Western nations in 2022. There are unconfirmed reports that Putin also has a third daughter, a woman by the name of Elizaveta Krivonogih, or Luisa Rozova, who was born in St. Petersburg in 2003 to a cleaner and who now lives in Paris. She does bear an uncanny resemblance to Vladimir and has spoken of being his child, although she opposes his actions in Eastern Europe. Vladimir Putin remains the perennial focus of the Putin family. He is in a shifting position as we enter the second half of the 2020s. His power in Russia itself is completely unchallenged. There appears to be no clear successor to Alexei Navalny as an anti-Putin campaigner, and he has reasserted his control over the military after the embarrassing abortive rebellion of Yevgeny Prigozhin in 2023. Putin is also a comparatively young man in an era of octogenarian heads of state. He will only turn 80 in 2032, meaning that Russia might well be controlled by him for many years to come, as he is a seemingly healthy individual despite 20 years of unsubstantiated news reports that he is suffering from everything from cancer to leprosy and Parkinson's disease. These sensationalist reports aside, there seems little to stop Putin ruling for many years to come, and by then there may be other Putins playing a role in national politics in a more concerted way than they do today. The Putin family is mysterious. They certainly were not a prominent family in Russian society and politics with long-standing links to government. Instead, they appeared largely out of nowhere in the 20th century. The modern view is that Spiridon Putin was a cook for many years for the first two leaders of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, and that he also probably acted within the secret services. This suggests that the family were trusted, albeit shadowy, allies of the communist regime from the early days after the Russian Revolution. Yet, beyond the public statements of Vladimir Putin himself, there is very little hard evidence to prove that Spiridon was an influential figure. Indeed, the family's modest economic circumstances in the middle of the 20th century, when Vladimir Putin was born and grew up, would suggest the opposite, that they were just ordinary Russians living in comparative poverty in Leningrad. Therefore, the story of the family is in a real sense the story of one man, Vladimir Putin. Born in 1952, he grew up on the streets and courtyards of housing complexes in Leningrad and came to view joining the state secret services, the KGB, as a way to better his life. His years in the KGB in the 1970s and 1980s are, as is intended with any secret agent, quite secretive. But we know that he operated in Eastern Germany and would have spent time there, effectively watching Soviet rule over Eastern Europe collapse in the second half of the 1980s. Thereafter, his rise was as peculiar as it was swift. He returned to Russia and rose up through the ranks of the country's new democratic politics in St. Petersburg and Moscow, symbolically becoming the acting president of the Russian Federation on New Year's Eve in 1999. Although it took Putin years to fully demolish the young democratic process in Russia, gradually during the 2000s and early 2010s, he accomplished this. By the time he was re-elected as president in 2012 for a third term, he was basically the dictator of Russia. His influence has been immense over the nation's modern history, and he has sought to reconstruct the old Russian Empire by wars in the Caucasus and Ukraine. It is unknown to what extent he will continue to shape the politics of Europe in the future, or if he will ever hand over power before his death, Similarly, we cannot be sure if any member of his extended family will come forward to play a role in Russian politics after his time. At present, it seems unlikely that Putin's dynasty will continue in any real way beyond his lifetime. But nobody can be entirely sure. What do you think of the Putins? Do you think Spiridon Putin actually worked as a chef for Lenin and Stalin? Or has Vladimir invented some of his family's backstory? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.